The first light of dawn painted the Kenyan highlands in shades of amber and gold, but the beauty of the sunrise was lost on two small figures stumbling along the edge of the busy Nairobi-Mombasa highway. Jengo, barely 3 years old, moved with the determined gait of an elephant who had appointed himself protector. His little sister Mara, 18 months younger, stayed close behind him, her tiny trunk occasionally reaching out to touch his leg for reassurance. The night had been chaos. Thunder had split the sky like a giant's roar, and lightning had turned the savannah into a strobing nightmare. The elephant herd, startled by the sudden violence of the storm, had scattered in panic. In the confusion of trumpeting adults and pounding feet, the two youngest members had become separated from their family. Now, as the storm clouds retreated toward the eastern mountains, Jengo and Mara found themselves alone in a world that suddenly seemed too vast and dangerous. Jengo's ears flapped nervously as he surveyed their surroundings. The instincts passed down through generations told him that elephants belonged in the wild spaces, among the acacia trees near the watering holes, surrounded by the protective circle of their herd. This hard black surface beneath their feet felt wrong. The acrid smell of exhaust and rubber hurt his sensitive nose, and the occasional roar of passing vehicles sent tremors of fear through his small body. Mara pressed closer to her brother, her dark eyes wide with confusion and exhaustion. She had never been away from their mother for more than a few minutes, and the absence felt like a physical ache in her chest. Her stomach rumbled with hunger, but the familiar comfort of warm milk and gentle guidance was nowhere to be found. All she had was Jengo, and she clung to his presence like a lifeline. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, a ribbon of human construction cutting through the ancient landscape. To their right, the rolling hills of the Great Rift Valley disappeared into morning mist. To their left, sparse acacia woodland offered the promise of familiar territory, but a tall wire fence stood between them and home. Jengo had tried to push through the barrier during the night, leaving small scrapes along his trunk and forehead, but the metal mesh held firm. As the sun climbed higher, the traffic began to increase. Cars and buses rushed past in both directions, their drivers too focused on their destinations to notice the two small elephants walking along the shoulder. The noise was overwhelming, a constant stream of engine roars, honking horns, and the whoosh of air displaced by speeding vehicles. Each time a particularly large truck thundered past, both calves would freeze their bodies, tensing with primal fear. Jengo's protective instincts kicked in with every approaching vehicle. He would position himself between Mara and the road, his small body a living shield against the mechanical predators that roared past them. His trunk would curl protectively around her, and he would make soft rumbling sounds deep in his throat, the same comforting noises their mother used to calm them during thunderstorms back in the safety of the herd. The morning wore on, and their steps became increasingly unsteady. Neither calf had eaten since the previous afternoon, and the stress of their situation was taking its toll. Mara's usual playful energy had drained away, replaced by a listless exhaustion that worried her older brother. She stumbled more frequently now, her legs shaking with fatigue. It was nearly 8 o'clock when the massive freight truck appeared around the bend ahead of them. The driver, already running late with his delivery to the coast, was pushing his vehicle hard along the straight stretch of highway. His eyes were focused on the road ahead, calculating arrival times and fuel stops, when two small gray shapes suddenly materialized in his peripheral vision. The moment stretched like eternity. Jengo saw the truck bearing down on them and knew with the clarity that comes in moments of crisis that they were in mortal danger. Without hesitation, he threw his body toward Mara, pushing her away from the road's edge with all his strength. The impact sent the smaller elephant tumbling into the grass beside the highway, but it also threw Jengo off balance. The truck driver hit his brakes hard, the screech of tires on asphalt piercing the morning air. The massive vehicle slewed sideways, its trailer jackknifing as it fought against momentum and physics. In the cab, the driver wrestled with the steering wheel, his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched the smaller elephant, Jengo, scramble desperately to get clear of the truck's path. The collision, when it came, was not the catastrophic impact it could have been. The truck's bumper caught Jengo a glancing blow along his left side, spinning him around and sending him sprawling onto the asphalt. The truck finally came to a stop 50 meters down the road. Diesel smoke pouring from its exhaust stack, the driver's hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. For a moment, the world was silent except for the ticking of cooling metal and the distant call of a fish eagle. Then Mara's terrified trumpeting filled the air. She had landed hard in the roadside grass. The wind knocked from her lungs, but Django's sacrifice had saved her from serious harm. Now she could see her brother lying motionless on the black surface of the road, and every instinct in her small body screamed that something was terribly wrong. The truck driver climbed down from his cab on unsteady legs. He was a man in his 50s, weathered by years of long-haul driving across East Africa, but he had never experienced anything like this. His cargo was insured, his schedule was demanding, but as he looked at the two small elephants, one injured and unconscious, the other crying out in distress, all of that seemed suddenly insignificant. He approached Django cautiously. The young elephant was breathing, but unconscious blood seeping from scrapes along his left flank and front leg where he had hit the asphalt. His left foreleg was bent at an awkward angle, not broken, but clearly strained and painful. The driver pulled out his phone with trembling fingers, but realized he had no idea who to call. The police. A veterinarian, how did one handle a situation like this? In his panic and guilt, the driver made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. He looked around at the empty highway, calculated the potential legal complications, and thought about his family, depending on his income. Within minutes, he was back in his truck, driving away from the scene as fast as he legally could, leaving the two elephant calves alone on the roadside. Mara struggled to her feet, every muscle in her small body aching from her tumble. She limped toward her brother, her trunk extended, making the soft contact sounds that elephants use to comfort each other. When Django didn't respond, she began to panic. She nudged him gently with her trunk, then more insistently, her distress calls growing louder and more desperate. The sun was climbing toward its zenith when Dr. Rebecca Walsh's Land Rover rounded the same curve where the accident had occurred. Rebecca was running late for her shift at the David Sheldrick Wildlife Trust's Elephant Orphanage, having been delayed by a call about an injured buffalo near Tsavo. At 55, she had spent more than half her life working with African wildlife, but she had never become hardened to suffering. The scene that greeted her was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Two elephant calves, far from where they should have been, clearly in distress. The larger one, Django, lay unconscious on the asphalt, his breathing shallow but steady. The smaller one, Mara, stood guard over him, her trunk resting gently on his back, her eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. Rebecca pulled her vehicle to the side of the road and approached slowly, her experienced eye already assessing the situation. She had seen hundreds of orphaned elephants over the years, victims of poaching drought, human encroachment, and accidents just like this one. But something about these two particular calves touched her deeply. Perhaps it was the obvious bond between them, or the way the little female refused to leave her brother's side despite her own obvious distress. Django was alive, which was the most important thing. His injuries appeared to be relatively minor, scrapes and bruises, a strained leg, but nothing that suggested internal damage or broken bones. He had been incredibly lucky. Mara showed no signs of serious injury, just exhaustion and dehydration. Rebecca worked quickly but gently, using her portable equipment to check both calves' vital signs. Django's pulse was strong, his breathing regular. The scrapes along his side would need cleaning and bandaging, and his strained leg would require rest and careful monitoring, but he would recover. Mara was simply exhausted and frightened, understandable conditions that time and care would heal. The challenge now was getting them both to safety. Rebecca radioed for backup, requesting a transport truck equipped to handle juvenile elephants. While she waited, she sat with the calves, speaking to them in the gentle, rhythmic tones that seemed to comfort distressed animals. She offered Mara water from her emergency supply, watching as the little elephant drank eagerly. When Django finally began to stir, the first thing he did was search for his sister. His trunk moved weakly across the ground until it found her, and only then did his tense muscles begin to relax. Rebecca watched this reunion with professional interest and personal emotion. The bond between these siblings was clearly profound. It would be crucial to their recovery and future well-being. The rescue truck arrived within an hour, staffed by experienced handlers who specialized in elephant care. Loading the calves required patience and gentle coaxing. Django was still too weak to walk far, so they used a specially designed stretcher to move him. Mara refused to be separated from her brother, staying close to his side throughout the entire process. As the truck began its journey toward the elephant orphanage, Rebecca rode in the back with her new charges. She had handled hundreds of rescues, but there was something special about these two. Django's protective instincts toward his sister, even in his injured state, spoke to a depth of character that was remarkable in such a young animal, and Mara's fierce loyalty, her refusal to abandon her brother despite her own fear and discomfort, demonstrated the powerful bonds that make elephants such extraordinary creatures. The first part of their story was ending, but Rebecca knew that the real journey was just beginning. These two calves would need months of care, careful medical attention, and the kind of emotional support that only comes from understanding the complex social needs of elephants. They had survived their first crisis, but the road ahead would test both their resilience and the dedication of the humans who had committed to saving them. The David Sheldrick Wildlife Trust's Elephant Orphanage was a sanctuary born from tragedy and sustained by hope. Nestled in the green hills outside Nairobi, it served as a halfway house between death and freedom for dozens of young elephants who had lost their families to the harsh realities of modern Africa. Dr. Rebecca Walsh had worked here for 8 years, and she still felt a surge of pride every time she drove through the gates. The orphanage was more than just a rescue facility. It was a carefully designed environment that mimicked as much as possible the social structure and natural behaviors of wild elephant herds. The youngest orphans lived closest to the human caretakers, requiring round-the-clock attention and bottle feeding every few hours. As they grew older and stronger, they gradually moved to enclosures with more space and less human intervention, preparing them for their eventual return to the wild. Django and Mara arrived at the orphanage on a Thursday afternoon, their transport truck carefully navigating the winding road that led to the medical facility. Word of their rescue had already spread among the staff, and several experienced keepers gathered to help with their arrival. Rebecca had radioed ahead with her initial assessment, but everyone knew that the next few hours would be crucial in determining the calves' prognosis. The medical examination was thorough but gentle. Dr. Patrick Kimani, the orphanage's head veterinarian, worked alongside Rebecca to assess both animals' conditions. Django was conscious but groggy, his left foreleg swollen and tender from the impact with the truck. The scrapes along his side were superficial, but would need careful cleaning to prevent infection. Most importantly, there were no signs of internal injuries or neurological damage. Mara's examination revealed exhaustion, mild dehydration, and some bruising from her tumble into the roadside grass, but nothing that wouldn't heal with rest and proper nutrition. However, her psychological state was more concerning. She remained pressed against Django's side throughout the examination, trembling whenever the veterinarians tried to separate them, even briefly. Her dark eyes darted constantly between the humans around her, and she flinched at sudden movements or loud noises. The decision was made to house the siblings together in one of the larger enclosures normally reserved for single elephants. This was unusual protocol. Typically, new arrivals were isolated for observation, but the obvious psychological benefits of keeping them together outweighed the standard procedures. A comfortable shelter was prepared with soft sand flooring, fresh hay, and constant access to clean water. Django's treatment began immediately. His strained leg was wrapped in a supportive bandage, and he was given anti-inflammatory medication to reduce swelling and pain. The scrapes were cleaned and treated with antiseptic, then covered with protective dressings. Throughout the entire process, he remained remarkably calm, as if he understood that these humans were trying to help him. The first night was difficult. Django's pain medication made him drowsy, but every time he began to doze, Mara would become agitated. She seemed convinced that if she let him sleep, he might not wake up. Rebecca spent the night in a chair beside their enclosure, monitoring Django's vital signs and trying to reassure Mara with gentle words and calm presence. It was during those quiet nighttime hours that Rebecca began to truly understand the depth of the bond between the two calves. Mara would curl up against her brother's uninjured side, her trunk resting across his back in a gesture of protection and comfort. Django, despite his exhaustion and pain, would periodically lift his head to check on her, his trunk gently touching her face or ears in reassurance. The second day brought new challenges. Both calves needed to eat, but neither showed much interest in the specially formulated elephant milk that was offered to them. This was not uncommon. Orphaned elephants often went through a period of grief and adjustment that affected their appetite. But prolonged refusal to eat could quickly become life-threatening for young animals already stressed by trauma and injury. Rebecca tried every technique she knew. She varied the temperature of the milk, added different flavoring agents, offered it in different containers. She tried hand-feeding them with bottles, bowls, and even large syringes. Django would occasionally accept small amounts, but Mara remained stubbornly uninterested in anything the humans offered her. It was Sarah Ndungu, one of the orphanage's most experienced keepers, who finally achieved the breakthrough. Sarah had been working with elephant orphans for 15 years, and she had an intuitive understanding of their psychological needs. Instead of trying to coax Mara to eat, she focused her attention on Django, sitting beside him and patiently offering him small amounts of milk while largely ignoring Mara. The strategy worked because it addressed Mara's primary concern, her brother's well-being. When she saw Django beginning to eat, her own survival instincts finally overcame her fear and suspicion. She approached cautiously, her trunk exploring the bowl of milk that Sarah held. The first taste was tentative, but once she realized the liquid was both safe and nourishing, she began to drink eagerly. This breakthrough marked the beginning of their recovery, but it also established a pattern that would continue throughout their rehabilitation. Mara's willingness to accept help was directly tied to her perception of Django's safety and comfort. If he was eating, she would eat. If he seemed calm around a particular human, she would gradually accept that person's presence. Her brother had become her anchor in a world that had suddenly become unpredictable and frightening. The third day brought encouraging progress. Django was able to stand and walk short distances, favoring his injured leg, but bearing weight on it without obvious distress. His appetite was returning to normal, and he showed interest in his surroundings for the first time since the accident. Most importantly, he began to interact with his human caretakers, allowing them to touch him, and even showing curiosity about their activities. Mara remained more cautious, but she was clearly gaining confidence. She would venture a few steps away from Django to explore their enclosure, always keeping him in sight and returning quickly to his side if anything startled her. She began to show interest in the various enrichment items that the keepers provided: logs to climb on, tire swings to play with, and mud wallows for cooling off. Dr. Rebecca Walsh found herself spending more time with the two calves than was strictly necessary from a medical standpoint. There was something about their relationship that fascinated her on both professional and personal levels. She had studied elephant behavior for decades, but witnessing the development of this sibling bond in real time was providing insights that no textbook could offer. On the fourth day, Rebecca made a decision that would prove crucial to both calves' long-term well-being. Instead of assigning them to different keepers according to standard protocol, she chose to become their primary caretaker herself. This was unusual. As the facility's head veterinarian, she typically focused on medical care rather than daily animal husbandry. But she recognized that these particular elephants needed consistency and stability above all else. The decision paid immediate dividends. With Rebecca as their constant presence, both calves began to show rapid improvement. Django's trust in her allowed him to accept medical treatments without stress, which accelerated his physical healing. Mara, seeing her brother's acceptance of this particular human, began to develop her own relationship with Rebecca. The breakthrough moment came during Rebecca's second week as their primary caretaker. She was sitting in their enclosure during the afternoon rest period, updating medical records on her tablet while Django dozed nearby. Mara had been playing at the far end of the enclosure, but gradually worked her way closer to where Rebecca sat. Without warning, the little elephant reached out with her trunk and gently touched Rebecca's hand. It was a simple gesture lasting only a few seconds, but it represented a fundamental shift in their relationship. For the first time since the accident, Mara had initiated positive contact with a human being. Rebecca remained perfectly still, allowing the calf to explore her hand and arm with a sensitive tip of her trunk. When Mara finally stepped back, Rebecca spoke to her in the same gentle tone she used, with all the orphans acknowledging the gift of trust she had just been given. From that point forward, Mara's progress accelerated dramatically. She began to seek out Rebecca's attention, following her around the enclosure and even attempting to mimic some of her activities. She would watch intently as Rebecca checked Django's bandages, occasionally reaching out to touch the medical supplies with her trunk. Her natural curiosity, suppressed by trauma and fear, was finally beginning to reassert itself. Django's physical recovery proceeded smoothly. His leg strength returned gradually, and by the end of the second week, he was walking normally with only occasional stiffness. The scrapes on his side had healed cleanly, leaving barely visible scars that would fade with time. More importantly, his natural elephant behaviors were returning. He spent time dust bathing, playing with enrichment objects, and engaging in the complex social interactions that are essential to elephant development. The relationship between the siblings evolved as they recovered. Initially, their bond had been forged in crisis with Django as protector and Mara as the protected. But as they regained their health and confidence, a more balanced dynamic emerged. Mara began to assert her own personality, showing the playful mischievousness typical of young elephants. She would sneak up behind her brother and surprise him with gentle trunk taps or steal choice pieces of food when he wasn't looking. Django, no longer burdened with the constant need to protect his sister from immediate danger, began to display his own individual characteristics. He was naturally curious about mechanical objects, spending long periods examining the latches on gates or the wheels on wheelbarrows. He showed remarkable problem-solving abilities, figuring out how to operate simple puzzle feeders that challenged even older elephants at the facility. Rebecca documented their progress meticulously, not just for medical records, but because she recognized that she was witnessing something special. The recovery of orphaned elephants typically followed predictable patterns, but Django and Mara were defying many of the standard timelines. Their mutual support seemed to accelerate their healing in ways that individual care couldn't match. By the end of their first month at the orphanage, both calves had achieved most of the initial recovery milestones. They were eating well, gaining weight appropriately, and showing normal elephant behaviors. More importantly, they had formed strong bonds not only with each other, but also with their human caretakers. This last element was crucial. Elephants who remained too fearful of humans often struggled with the eventual transition back to wild herds. The success of their recovery, however, brought new questions. The ultimate goal of the orphanage was always to return healthy elephants to their natural habitat. But the timing and process of that transition required careful consideration. Some elephants were ready for release within a year, while others needed several years of preparation. For Django and Mara, the answer would depend not just on their individual development, but on how well they could maintain their bond while also learning to interact with other elephants. As their second month at the orphanage began, Rebecca knew that the next phase of their journey would be just as challenging as their initial recovery. They would need to learn to be wild elephants again, but without losing the resilience and mutual support that had carried them through their darkest hours. The foundation had been laid, but the real test was still to come.